questions people often ask is the quality of life under a democratic socialist system better? And this answer is it's definitely better. People get more vacation time, people get pensions, people get universal health care, people get better roads and better transportation systems and public transportation, more affordable housing, less tuition for schools. But is it better for your health? Yes. If you don't have to worry as much, you have less stress in your life, you have all of the baseline safety net taken care of by the government, which you've paid into through your taxes, so you have less stress overall. You get more out of the government, even though you are paying more into it. And in addition to that, because you have guaranteed universal health care in most social democracies, yes, you are healthier. Let me know what your thoughts are below, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Take care. Thanks for watching.